I actually just spent some time trying to learn the names of the people that I'm about to introduce because I am accustomed. I will answer to anything that starts with SH, basically. So I'm going to introduce everybody at once and then ask you all to speak one after another if you all are willing. Looking for all of you. So I am about to probably also destroy these names, for which I apologize. So Lena Lund, who is Dean of the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts, will begin, and then Elsebeth Nielsen, the Dean of Design School at Kolding, will follow, and then Sarah Lawrence, who's the Dean here of the School of Art and Design History and Theory at Parsons, will follow after, and then we'll have a discussion. Thank you very much. I'm going to start your slides.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. The Royal Academy is quite an old school. It's 263 years old. However, I do think we are working with design for the future, and I hope that will come across as I speak. In the very early days of 2016, a big group of students and employees came to my office and said, look, Lene, we want the KADK, which is the shortening of the Royal Academy, etc. We want KADK to work with the UN Sustainability Goals, Development Goals, sorry. And I said, well, yeah, that's a good idea. You know, the government isn't doing anything. They weren't at the point. I couldn't see anyone around doing something, so we said, maybe that is the job of KADK. And so since that time, we've been working intensively with those goals. The whole academy, including conservation and architecture and design. And one of the first visible signs of what we were doing was the diploma graduate project exhibition we had in the summer of 2017, where we had 267 projects on exhibition. And every project had a small explanation, and you could then see which goals the project was addressing. The exhibition was called Solutions, but I want to make a point here, because I think that those design projects are much more than solutions. I mean, lots of people are working with solutions. In fact, we have too many solutions sometimes to some of the problems we have, but the fact is that people don't use them. So I want to speak about aesthetics here. I want to talk about the artistic value of design, because I think at the end of the day, the artistic value, the aesthetical value is what makes people choose the right design. And also addressing the problem in the world that we were just facing, you know, complexity, disruption, you name it, we've got it. A lot of people are feeling a bit lost, and you know, one of the big jobs of design is actually to make people feel at home, to feel comfortable with the things, the surroundings we have. And in order for that to happen, the aesthetics have to reflect the values of the people using them. So that's the role of aesthetics, in short. So, sorry. I hope it still works. It does. I'm just going to show you very quickly 3 examples of those diploma projects. They are all, as I said, working with the SDGs, and for instance, this one is number 12. But it's important to say as well that you cannot only work with the SDGs. You have to, of course, also look into the big global trends that are actually happening and making these goals even more necessary. And one of them is the scarcity of resources. Within the next 15 years, we will have 3 billion people in the world moving from poverty to middle class. They will use so many resources that we cannot even imagine. So at the moment we have an exhibition about a circular economy, and this is one of the solutions. And I just want to show you this project which is made by Helene. And what she did was to take an old material, which is the skin of salmon, that in the old days in Denmark and Greenland, they were used for shoes, etc. And she has now been working with this material, actually using it for furniture design. So this is an example of how you can reuse or use materials that are otherwise just thrown away. Another example is goal number 3, dealing with good health and well-being. the world is getting older. This is another global trend. And you were talking about that, Matilda, as well. And this, in fact, is an old man which suffers from dementia. And Emilie, who made this project, was working with the Organization of Dementia in Denmark, and she was working in a sort of hospital for people with this illness. And based on these experiences, she made objects for people suffering from dementia. I'm not going to go deep into it, but today in those homes for people with dementia, actually they go down to buy toy for children to use the problems that people with dementia had. And that just isn't worthy of people with this illness. So this is what she's addressing. And again, I hope it comes across that this is very much an aesthetical solution as well. The third one, and Tim, you just explained about this one, so I can do it very briefly. This is the Chemo2Go project, yes. And again, this group of students were working with a hospital in Copenhagen, and I just want to say now that the good thing is that after they graduated, now the whole group, I think, is employed at the hospital, working in a sort of department of innovation within the hospital. So this is a program we have working with co-creation. That's actually the title of the program. But still, if the bag carrying the chemo isn't aesthetical, the right one, people are not going to wear this with this illness. So having said that, I'll pass on the word to the next speaker. Thank you.
I think as universities, we have a huge responsibility to help turn this age of dissolution or decline into a new age of enlightenment. We must address the feeling of hopelessness. I do not expect many of you to speak Danish, but as you can see, in Danish the difference is only one letter. Dissolution in Danish is opløsning, and enlightenment is oplysning. To change that one letter, that is our main responsibility as knowledge institutions at the moment in time. So go from opløsning to oplysning. I think that is our main responsibility. Walking around this fantastic school is very inspiring. This is a place for optimism and fun, madness and creativity. Imagine if this atmosphere prevailed in our societies too. I so hope that our transatlantic collaboration will carry the atmosphere of this place much further into society. I hope that our collaboration will mean that we get much more impact as design communities. Imagine if together we could show the business community how to use the lack of resources as a lever for creating sustainable systems. For instance, the fashion industry is one of the world's most polluting industries. Let us help this industry by showing how design can help foster a more circular fashion cycle. Here is an example from Design School Kolding. It's a raincoat made of 100% recyclable polyester from Japan. And as you can see, it's recyclable and it's also very beautiful. You can pass it on. You can also take it on. And together with Assistant Professor Timo Riisanen here at Parsons, we are investigating how to prolong the lifetime of garments. We also brought an example of how the future might look like if we started seeing waste as a resource. During the break, I hope you will visit our supermarket, where we have beautiful art pieces made out of waste from small and medium-sized Danish companies. And it's just outside here. Furthermore, imagine if we could show the public how design can help create cohesions and new communities. Since 2012, our local municipality in Kolding has had a strategy called We Design Life. This means that from cradle to grave, the city uses design to increase quality of life and happiness. Because of the success of this strategy, Kolding was just announced Kolding UNESCO Design City. So let us come together and show that design is democratic and not reserved for the rich. Furthermore, imagine if we could show the public how design can help create, finally, imagine that together we decide to make our communities more creative. Research shows that play is a key factor when it comes to producing more creative human beings. Therefore, we have established a MA program in Design for Play in conjunction with Lego. Why don't we join forces and invite Denmark and New York, indeed the whole world, to play? And let us start now. We brought a set of Lego bricks. Here we go. And with these Lego bricks, you can build a dock. And please start and see how differently you can design a dock using only 6 bricks. And while you are building, imagine the world we would have if all human beings were able to unfold their full potential. This is the difference design can make. Remember, it is only about changing one letter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm going to start slowly so you have a chance to work on your ducks. And just keep working while I'm talking. I will not be offended. I want to see what we all come up with at the end. So I'm going to reintroduce myself to make an emphasis. I'm Sarah Lawrence, the Dean of the School of Art and Design, History and Theory. So there is a whole school here at Parsons that's committed to the historical and theoretical education of our future designers. And I was really pleased to see in the charge to this afternoon session, how do we build upon past design legacies? Well, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so I like that, this idea of how does the past matter to us? So what I'm going to do now is, there clearly are enormous numbers of consistencies and camaraderies between the work we're doing in our design schools and yours. So the idea of a partnership here makes extraordinary sense, and I know this is just the beginning of an ongoing partnership. There's a shared commitment to designing for a difference, whether it's looking at sustainability, issues of public health, the aging population, and the like. So I'm going to run through some of our projects that will be consistent with this spirit, but I also want to talk about where history and theory might play in discussion of these things, because I do think that part of our responsibility as designers is to remind our students why history and critical reflection really matter as they work towards design solutions to make the world a better place. So what I'm showing you now is a beautiful assemblage, which is an evocation of our Healthy Materials Lab, which is a lab intended to raise awareness about toxins in building products. And it asks the question of, to what extent would it be useful to these students and these faculty, our colleagues working in this lab, to reconsider or to learn about the attention to the dishes that we eat off of, that we drink from, the utensils with which we carve our food, the dyes we use to dye our fabrics and live with, that were very carefully tended to as toxins that had to be accommodated and required intervention as early as the 12th century, the 4th century. I can think of any number of examples. What could our students learn in coming up with new ideas for healthy materials by looking back at theories of alchemy, of the four humors from the early modern era that showed modes of innovation in design practice that informed the work that was done then. Here's one of my personal favorites, Street Seats, which is the annual collaboration that Parsons has in the School of Constructed Environments with the Department of Transportation, in which a sustainable project creates a kind of urban oasis. And sadly, ours was just dismantled, so you will not have a chance to see it this year. But it's set up on 13th Street, and as you can see here, or actually you can't really see here, but what this is a framework for like a little seating area that becomes a spontaneous area for congregation, for relaxation, or just to kind of lighten your mood when you walk out of the university center and think that you have to remind yourself why it's fun to live in New York City. And it reminds me, as a scholar of Renaissance art history, about the incredible importance of the ephemeral design, which was so important during this period, ephemeral design for all the festivities that took place. This occupied some of the greatest artists and designers of the period, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo, just to name the great triumvirate. These ephemeral designs were really integral to the animation of the urban spaces. And so there's a whole tradition of something comparable to Street Seats. And it would be fascinating to keep in mind as we teach our students, how is it that looking backwards can help us look forward in a new way? This extraordinary outfit, came out from a student in the School of Fashion, Jacob Olmedo, who was majoring in the materialities pathway in the School of Fashion. And it was a collaboration with hydroponic farmers, botanists, and textile designers to consider new forms of materials and clothing that would be sensitive to changes in climate. And when I looked at this, I immediately thought of innovations in 18th century Paris, where their new sewage system allowed for urban farming in the Paris center, and was really kind of the origin of the locavore movement, as far as I'm concerned. But it led to changes in fashion design and ways in which you could dress appropriately, not ruin the hem of your garment, include flowers as a way of improving body odor, all different ways in which people would surround themselves with flowers, with other types of ivies and plants that were strongly aromatic, and similarly address dress styles and hems to accommodate the surrounding environment. This extraordinary top is a design that came out of the Open Style Lab, run by Grace June, who is an alum of the program and is now on the faculty. And it's a lab that designs clothing for individuals with disabilities. And this particular garment was designed for someone who has a dislocated shoulder. That's a kind of chronic disorder that constantly needs to keep the shoulder in place so it doesn't dislocate during sleep or during activity. And my first thought was to think of an early corset design that was intended for a woman of court who struggles with scoliosis. And so they wanted the same body form as everyone else, but attentive corset design intended specifically to provide support that wasn't, of course, medical with concern. It was purely in terms of appearance, but very, very similar notions to bracing the body and to create a desired form and solidity to the structure. And the final project I'm going to mention is by Professor Salehi, A Drone for Refugees, which is a project that he designed for his students to monitor migrant boats in dangerous waters, to help us do a better job at identifying those potentially going into dangerous areas who might need to be immediately rescued. And similarly, if you look at their extraordinary devices for surveillance, certainly those that were designed during the 1950s during the Cold War, that raise a lot of really provocative questions about what it means to keep an eye on your population, to help them and to monitor them. And so again, it raises questions for our students that they may be thinking of purely in the present tense, but the historical perspective can very much enrich their design innovations. So I'm hoping that maybe in the conversation, we can extend our discussion a little bit from our very urgent and important attention to the contemporary and the future, and to speak a little bit, if my fellow deans similarly find that tug of looking back at history. Thank you.
I'm extremely self-conscious of not speaking into the mic, so I've been told not to not speak into the mic. So What I meant to say without the mic was, let's all gather our chairs around and have a conversation. But I didn't have the mic, so I didn't say it yet. My name is Shana Shah, and I'm an assistant professor here at Parsons, and I teach across a range of areas. And one of the things I do that is apropos of what all of you have spoken to is that right now I run our undergraduate first-year program. I also think a lot about design education, and what it means to teach people to do these various things that you all are talking about. And in particular, what it means to build entire programs around the idea of teaching people this, right? So not just the practicalities of doing the teaching, but what it means to build a whole series of classes or a whole curriculum across multiple different forms, working with people positioned in a range of different ways. So I heard some themes across what you all were speaking about. I'm just gonna try to frame a couple of questions in relationship to that before we open it up. So I heard in this idea of levers that Elsbeth, that you raised, this idea of reframing and thinking about what it means to actually imagine not just a specific design course or a moment of working with a particular project, but actually the whole of thinking about what design education might be doing as a project of reframing not only how individual students or faculty or partners might think about things, but in fact, how we sort of imagine the process of thinking about things, making them material for design. I also heard themes, Lena, and what you spoke about time and temporality and this idea of global trends and how we know that those trends oftentimes are ascendant and they sometimes rule us in their thinking, but that they themselves change all the time. So rather than always feeling like we're trying to catch up as educators, what are the ways in which we can both anticipate them, but know, I think, Sarah, to your point, there are themes that are in fact much deeper and much richer that we can anticipate not by sort of chasing what trends might be, but understanding those trends as part of these sort of long-term cyclical sort of ideas. I also heard all of you speak in very different ways about the importance of specificity. So the specificity of the body, the specificity of a particular partnership, the specificity of how again, a program or a degree is built, whether it's around the UN sustainability goals or whether it's around an attention to history and theory, or this idea even of the specific letter in the word that changes the entire meaning of what we're looking at, right? And then finally, the other thing that I heard sort of echoing around in there was I think in the US context, we think of design research differently and less, I'll just be frank, than we often do in the US context, where industry has often sort of ruled. And I think that the notion of research and the idea that what we do is research-based and what designers can do is research-based through a range of different ways is something that I heard echoed strongly. And I think it is incredibly important for this kind of historical and contextualizing work, Sarah, that you're bringing forward, right? So I heard these sort of really compelling sets of overlaps. And so the questions I think I want to pose, I wrote down a bunch of them, and I'm gonna say one, and then we'll see if we have time, and I'll get to the other. So I'm interested, given all of this, what you think the relationship in contemporary design education is between our understandings of history and our sort of contending with, oftentimes we talk about design as this sort of future-making project, and I'm really interested in this idea of the present, right, and how we bring our understandings of history and our sort of projections into the future, into the everyday education of students and the building of community among students and faculty and others in classrooms or in programs. And so I'm wondering if you all would be interested in talking at all about the specificity of how you think education becomes an important part of shaping how we understand the presentness of design. If that makes sense. And there should be another mic somewhere, although I will pass this down.
Well, I'll try to answer that. As you said, all the education we have at KDK is research-based, and a lot of that research goes into the history of Danish and international architecture and design and conservation, for that matter. And we find it extremely important that all our students know that which ground they are standing on, because history is not only history. History shows us values that this society we are in are based on. And through the objects that we can see still because they are here, the buildings, the whatever we see on museums displayed. It gives us an impression of the set of values and the development of values within the society that we are. And if we don't understand that, we don't know where we are at the present. So it's absolutely necessary to look back and understand what you come from, so to say.
I think one thing I'd add in terms of Parsons Approach specifically is this very full embrace of New York City itself as the laboratory for our students, and the way in which we try to engage them as completely as we can in different aspects of urban life, whether it's dealing with whether it's the trip to the UN, it's the Circle Line trip around the island to understand more fully our sustainable systems in place. I find that that's an extremely effective way in the students' very first year when they first arrived at Parsons to have that kind of complete immersive experience and a kind of self-critical experience of what kind of background they're bringing to Parsons and how it connects to the current life that they're having as a student in New York City. One of the things that strikes me is that I think when you talk about your relationship to your history, it's often your Danish history. And here, our community is so diverse among our students. One of the things we pay a lot of attention to is how to allow our students to bring in their history in connection with our present sort of coexistence in New York City. And that's probably one of our greatest challenges in education, is to find that appropriate sort of tenor so that everyone's voice feels that it's as legitimate and as relevant to their present day life in the city.
I think the most important thing we can teach our students that is about impact, that they must be doers, that they have to go out and improve life and society. So instead of teaching our students to design beautiful solutions, it is more about teaching them how to release the creativity of the users. So to use their own creativity as a lever for the development of creativity in society in general. And I think that's what design is about today, and that's what we as design institution also can teach the rest of the society. We have enough products. Perhaps we have also enough solutions, but we don't have enough creativity. So that's what we can contribute with as designers.
Yeah, please.
I think maybe one could misunderstand what I was saying, because I'm not actually talking about a Danish context here. Understanding history is a method. You have to teach, I think, the students how to read history based on the objects that are still here. That's all we have. I mean, you can read books as well, of course. And once you've learned that method of understanding your past, you can actually, and we do that, you can go out in the world in 4 weeks to China, Goa Desert, and you can understand quickly the history of that place because you've developed a method of reading the values of the past of the place you're visiting or you're working in. So it's more than just understanding Danish history. It's a method.
So one other question I have before we open it up. I think this is something that this will very much reflect my own questions. But something that I think often happens when we present design work is that we see mostly finished things, right? So we sometimes hear about process, but I'm thinking a lot actually of what you said about aesthetics and about what it means to be able to tell meaningful stories of the mess and the problems and the conflicts that come up in the process of attempting to collaborate, of the misunderstandings or the just incredible disparities in access or privilege even that come up in some of the partnerships that we talk about, or the ways even that within our own schools we might see those things emerge sort of as you're talking about, Sarah. And so in my own work, a lot of what I think about are the ways in which emotions become material in a design process, the ways in which we develop either consciously or not consciously relational practices that lead to this kind of capacity to make with other people. And I'm curious, I'm especially interested in thinking about how we tell these stories, both as educators working with students, but also begin to, and I struggle with this a great deal in my own teaching work, figure out how to work with students to tell those stories in ways that are both aesthetic, so that they can be understood, but not overly glossy, so that the mess does not get lost, right? So as we get into these increasingly, there's an increased willingness in design to deal with and talk about complexity. How do we not lose it at the same time in our efforts to kind of talk about how it works? And I'm curious, especially as educators and people who think about this from a design sort of education institution perspective, what thoughts you might have on presenting that mess in a way that's legible.
I hope I understood your question. Anyway, I think we have a dilemma here. Because to a certain extent, I feel that talking about how to solve the problems in the world, which I am and which I think we should do, I'm also betraying the core of what design is about. Because there's one thing in my mind that that designers can do that other people can't do, and that's the aesthetics. So, and the problem about the artistic or the aesthetics is that it's, to a certain degree, it's a silent language. And that's why it's so difficult to sell. That's why the politicians don't talk about, we have to have nice things or aesthetical matters. They talk about urgent problems that design has to solve, which it does. I'm not saying it shouldn't. But I think we should be very aware, and we are working a lot on that, on actually developing a language connected to the aesthetics. It's extremely important.
I would say that one thing we struggle with a lot here is getting our students to appreciate the mess. So we try to have our students share their work in the context of a learning portfolio, which is an online opportunity which allows them and their faculty to look back at the work that they've been doing. And there is an immediate draw towards showing the glossy, beautiful finished product. Or even if it's not glossy and not beautiful, it's the finished product. And to get them to recognize how much we appreciate and they should appreciate that messy process leading up to it is probably the biggest challenge we have with our learning portfolio. And I think Shana is exemplary in recognizing that it has to come from the educators to help the students stop and appreciate the mess and not be so quick to rush to the glossy finish.
We know that the companies using design has a much better bottom line than companies not using design. Actually, we know that over a 10 years period, the companies using design had a growth that was 228% higher than companies not using design. And I think it's important to teach our students about these kind of measurements, and that they must be aware of what is the value of design also in economic terms. I think we still teach them how to be very good in presenting the aesthetics, and it also means that they are good in presenting the products. But we have not yet learned to teach them what is the big value of design. And that's also the reason why we as design community doesn't have the influence we should have on the development of our world, I'm sorry to say. It is still the engineers and my friend from Johnson & Johnson can say much more about it. Cordy Swope, who is a teacher at Design School Kolding, I think that it is still people with a background as an economist or an engineer running the world. And when it comes to decision making and also the allocating of money, most of the money still goes to the fields that were important in the 20th century. And that's because we don't do what we should do as design universities. We are not able to really tell the rest of the society what is the value of design.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to hold on to that for a second. I always set my watch fast and I never tell myself how fast it is, which is a problem right this second. I think we have about 10 minutes. So I'm wondering if there are any questions out there.
Along the lines of what you were talking about in terms of messy, and because I know at Cooper Hewitt, we really, one of the important things when we either acquire work or show work is that process is really, really important, and showing all aspects of process. But the other thing, sort of even, taking that sort of a little deeper is what about, and I hate to use the word failure, but what about things that, maybe didn't work out? Because a lot of times those failures can lead to something else that's even better. And so maybe this is more of a comment than it is a question, but how do you as educators broach that with your students? And is that something that in some ways should be rewarded because they've tried something maybe that didn't work and they try something again? But how do you talk to your students about failures?
Could I say something? We actually need an exhibition with failures, with design failures. Perhaps you could help us with that.
Since I'm not teaching a studio class, I'm teaching a history seminar. It's a slightly different type of answer to your question. But one of the things I work with my students on is this idea of the intelligent mistake, and to try to get them to understand how much value there is in, they can get the date of the object wrong, who commissioned it wrong. There's so much incorrect information, as long as they can speak to the associations that they're making and the insights that they're having. So I'm really fond of this notion of the intelligent mistake.
This is one of the questions that we are discussing when we discuss, and we do that a lot, how much we should cooperate with industry. Because if industry gets too close to education, it creates certain expectations that there's a nice product at the end of the process. And I think we should be very aware of that. So it's fine to do that, and we do it a lot, but we are very aware of when to do it and under which conditions we are doing it. And this is to allow failures and experiments to happen.
Just thinking about how businesses are challenged today, that they really need to think new. Don't you sense a change in businesses' ability and desire to experiment and actually, I know it sounds so banal when you say it, but learn from failures?
Indeed. We are working with some of the big Danish companies, for instance, Lego and Echo. And the reason that they want to work with us is that we can offer them mistakes. And that we can offer them this atmosphere of experimentation and doing something that is not possible for them to do in their daily work. And that's the reason why we invite more and more, especially big companies, to work with us, because we really think we can learn from their expectations to us about being courageous.
So, as the person who Elizabeth called out, felt I had to say something. Also, being in a big corporation, and also having been at Kolding, that it's kind of the motto that we're adopting now in our organization, which is undergoing a massive transformation. It's a very large organization. At least on my team, it's only failure if you don't learn. Because in the past century, I think, and to go to this point of the world being run by engineers or economists, is that maybe that was true, but what we're finding in design is that business success is a byproduct of learning, right? It's not because in all these other professions, business success is the goal. If you achieve business success, you're on a yacht in Hawaii or something. But for designers, I think, and particularly for designers who I've seen in Denmark anyway, who I've taught or I've taught here. I teach at a school up the street. I won't say who it is. Has 3 initials. Is that what our duty as educators is to kind of make them learn, is to give them an appetite for learning. Because design is like one of the few professions, I think, where people are really motivated for learning all the time, because you have to do it as part of your job, right? And so like kind of getting to this point of like, imagine a world where everyone's learning, and where that's the currency rather than business success, or business success is a byproduct of it.
So I have one last thing I want to ask before we close. I'm looking at Rama because I obviously don't know what time it is. Okay. I think we have three minutes. Okay, we have 1 minute. I'm still going to ask this question. Because I think this is in part about bringing together these educational institutions and also government institutions across these two countries. And so my own experience working with educators in Denmark, which is completely separate from this, I had a fascinating conversation with a colleague of yours, Thomas Binder, at one point about the difference between working in a municipality in Copenhagen and working in a large city in California where I do my own design work. And without getting into the contexts, the thing that was fascinating to me was the set of assumptions that Thomas was explaining to me people had about the ownership they had and the capacity to force and push decision-making in a way that was not so much about representative democracy, but a presumption of living in space together. And so I'm curious if there are any sort of last comments that you all would have about what specific things in a sort of Danish context or in a US context we might have to exchange or sort of think together with across these two contexts when we're thinking about what it means to educate designers who are interested in working in these complex environments.
I can say shortly as a start that for sure critical thinking and critical dialogue is maybe the most important thing we can teach, and that is part of the answer, I'm sure.
I'm still thinking.
Yeah, but to continue, I also think critical thinking is the most important to teach our students for the moment. And I really think that we should also reconsider our responsibility as universities, because outside these walls, everything is going wrong. I'm sorry to say.
Don't be sorry.
But we are continuing as if nothing has happened, almost. So we have to reconsider our responsibility as knowledge institutions. And I think we should be responsible for doing something about fake news, for instance. Why don't we set up a fake news police? All universities in the world, every morning we read the news and then we make sure that somewhere you can find what is the truth. I think really we have to work in a totally a new way if we are going to have a position as knowledge institution in 10 years. We are on our way to lose it. Knowledge has no authority any longer. We have no authority in this room. We have to change that. I don't know how to do it, but I hope that this collaboration across countries might show us the way to regain our importance as knowledge institutions.
Sarah, do you want to have any last words?
All I can say is thank you, Elspeth, for those comments. I mean, it's a very important note to end on. And I think one of the things we all struggle with as designers is to be sure that what's happening in our school does constantly reconnect with the challenges of the outdoor world. And we cannot lose sight of what's going on. We recently held a day of disruption where every faculty member across the university was invited to not teach the expected curriculum and instead to do something else that would pull them out of the classroom and to think about the immediate aftermath of what's going on in the surrounding world. And it was a very effective way, I think, to remind us that we have this responsibility, both the faculty and the students, to break out of our studio immersion and remember what the point of all this work is.
Thank you all very much for your time. I think we're going to take another 15-minute coffee break, and then we'll be back here.